Hey guys, and welcome to another tutorial by artincontext.org where we explore various art-related topics. My name is Matt, and in today's tutorial we will be learning how to draw legs. More specifically, we will be looking at how to draw both male and female legs. Now, starting with the male legs, what we want to do is we first want to understand that the leg is kind of comprised of three main sections, at least within a drawing process. And this is where we have the upper features, which kind of establishes the general thigh area. Then we have the knee, the kind of smaller connecting feature between the upper and lower leg. And then we have the lower leg, which is comprised of the calf muscles and down to the ankle. What we'll do is we'll draw a pair of legs, providing us with a view of both the front and side angles to kind of establish or understand how these muscle groups are put together within a drawing. Now, when it comes to male physiques, something we need to understand is they're quite muscular, or at least have more muscle mass more often than that of a female leg. However, obviously all leg types are different, but in this particular tutorial we will be looking at drawing a very muscular male pair of legs and then a more toned and feminine looking female pair of legs. That being said, let's get started. Now, using our pencils, what we first want to do is we want to establish the general shape of the leg. Now, when we look at a leg, we can kind of see this really elongated, slim, rectangular shape. What we want to do is we want to kind of establish those shapes that we will be drawing these muscle groups in for these three main sections. So what we can do with our pencils is we can draw these elongated, rectangular, oval-like shapes for the thigh, which we can then do a smaller circular shape for the connecting joint, the knee, and then another rectangular elongated shape for the lower part of the leg. We also want to establish that the upper part of the leg is quite similar in scale to the lower part of the leg. However, the lower part of the leg, which includes the calf muscles towards the ankle, tends to be slightly more narrow. So we can proceed to do this. Now, once we have established these basic shapes, what we're going to do is we're going to start working a general outline into those shapes, where we slowly refine those shapes into a more identifiable structure of the legs. And this is where we want to consider the different muscle groups. Now, the leg is comprised of various muscle groups that work together. Beneath the surface of the skin, obviously these muscle groups protrude and therefore are going to create these curves and indentations along the outline of the leg. So when we work from the thigh down to the ankles, what we'll find is that the vastus medial, or your quad muscle, tends to protrude quite significantly, as well as the vastus laterals, which is the muscle on the other side of the thigh, the outer side of the thigh. And this causes a bulging that becomes more narrow as we flow in towards the knee area. Now, obviously the kneecap, or the patella, another word for the kneecap, is going to be this middle component that is a kind of narrow bone in relation to the width of the upper and lower leg that will connect the upper leg to the lower leg. So naturally, as we continue drawing with our pencil, what we want to do is we want to start slowly merging the upper leg with this generalized outline into the lower leg. And this is where we consider how these features kind of bulge. At this point, what we want to do is we first want to establish both legs in a generalized outline, and then we can start integrating more defined line work and shadowing to emphasize the muscle groups within both the legs. So working with your pencil, as we kind of flow into the lower section of the first leg, which could be described as the right leg, we want to consider how the narrowing near the knee area starts to then bulge slightly again as we get to the muscles in the lower leg. Now, the lower leg consists mainly of 5 muscle groups, which could be described as the gastrocnemius, soleus, plantaris, tibialis, and peroneus muscles. Now, we don't necessarily need to worry too much about these fine details. However, looking at a diagram of legs is a great way to assist you in your drawing process, because this is going to make the process of understanding the muscle groups a little better, and therefore understanding how the compositional nature of these muscle groups flow together. So when we kind of merge the top section, or the upper thigh muscles, down towards the calf muscles, we can start to make the gastrocnemius, which is the larger calf area, slightly more bulging, and therefore giving it a little bit more of a bulging curve which then becomes slightly more narrow as we shift down. The more narrow area near the ankle, which kind of consists of the peroneus muscles, such as the peroneus brevis, and so on and so on. As we kind of continue with that drawing, we can then work our way into shaping the foot, where we give the heel of the foot a more 90-degree type angle, and then working our way into the toes. Now, again, you can kind of use any visual reference to draw these legs. However, there is a visual reference available in a link below, which is being used for this drawing process. Now, as we continue, something we want to consider as well is that the muscles in the lower section of the leg, which tend to be seemingly smaller than the muscles in the upper section of the leg, still do bulge slightly. So this means we want to consider the more subtle curvatures within the lower leg, and this is particularly true for the muscles around the shin bone present in the front area of the lower leg near the shin bone. This muscle, called the tibialis anterior, is quite long and does slightly bulge. So the front section of the leg doesn't have this just vertical straight angle, rather it has a subtle curvature to it, which is defined by the tibialis anterior. Now this again flows into the knee section, which will then slightly bulge again as the patella kind of sits on top of these muscles and does have this bulging effect. So we do want to make sure we spend time working the outline of both these legs. We can actually transition to drawing in the second leg, which will be the left leg, and this is where we kind of draw the leg from more front view, paying attention to how the curvatures from both the upper section and the lower section are seen from a frontal view. Now again, the idea is to first establish the main three sections, being the upper leg areas, the middle area, which is the knee or the connecting feature, and then the lower leg area. And this is where we want to basically first establish those elongated, triangular or oval-like shapes for all of those three features, except the knee, which can be described as more of a circular feature connecting those two elongated shapes. And then from there, we kind of want to work with our pencil and eraser to slowly refine these shapes into a more identifiable leg outline. And this is where we spend time working on the outline of the leg, which will naturally be affected by the leg muscles in the upper leg, such as the quadriceps and the abductor muscles. Again, we really want to consider looking at a diagram of these different muscle groups, and this is going to help us understand a little more effectively how the shaping of the leg structure looks in a more naturalistic sense in terms of the scale of these muscles, specifically how large the upper muscle groups are in relation to the lower muscle groups. Now, the intention with drawing a realistic pair of legs is to spend time on, number one, first understanding these generalized shapes, number two, working in more refined line work to establish a realistic outline of these muscle groups in relation to those generalized shapes, and that's where you work with your pencil and eraser in tandem with one another to kind of refine the leg shape. From there, what we can start to do is we can start working in some pencil line work and shading to kind of refine and establish these muscle groups on the surface of the skin. So when we think about muscle groups, we really want to understand that muscle is quite a hard feature that bulges from beneath the surface of the skin. Now, due to that protruding quality, what is going to happen is there's going to be these shadow formations that kind of flow in between these muscle groups, and ultimately that's what we see when the muscle groups in the legs are quite defined. Now again, what we can do once we have established a general outline is we can start with the left leg, the front view. This is slightly a little easier, as the muscle groups in the upper and lower section of the leg seem to be a little bit more linear, and making it a little bit more easy to draw at first and understand before we move to the side view leg angle. Now, when we consider the different muscle groups, especially the upper muscles, we'll start with the upper muscles. The quadricep muscles are specifically interesting because they are quite elongated as they flow from the up. We will find that the quadriceps or the quad muscles are made up of these four main muscles. The central muscle that flows directly in the center of the quad down towards the patella is called the rectus femoris. That larger bulging muscle near the inside of the quadricep muscle group is called the vastus medialis, and that is where that kind of bulging larger inner muscle flows directly towards the inside of the kneecap. Then on the outside of the thigh, we have the vastus lateralis, which is a large muscle but slightly more slimmer or thinner than the vastus medialis, and that flows along the outside of the muscle. It's much more thinner than the central muscle in the center area of the thigh, and the vastus medialis, that's in a bulgy muscle near the inside of the kneecap. And then lastly, we have this muscle that kind of flows like a band over those muscles towards the inner groin area, and this is called the sartorius muscle, which is more like a strand. Now again, the way in which we define these muscles is simply by the utilization of some line work and shading work. What we also want to consider is how the tibialis anterior, which is that muscle that flows directly next to the shin as well as the shin bone, runs vertically down the central area of the lower leg. And this is where we find that the shin bone kind of divides the lower leg into these two sections, where the tibialis anterior kind of places on the outer section of the leg, and then the calf muscle or the gastrocnemius muscle, which is kind of those large calf muscles placed near the higher section of the lower leg, can also then bulge out slightly. However, we do tend to see that the leg becomes slightly more narrow as it shifts into the ankle towards the peroneus muscles. And now this is where we start to utilize both line work and shading to define these muscle groups. Now again, looking at a diagram of leg muscles is really helpful, because when we think about drawing a leg, what we are essentially doing is drawing these muscle groups. However, we are drawing them obviously less defined in their muscle composition, but we are drawing them represented through their bulging ability from beneath the surface of the skin. So the process is the same in the sense that what we want to do is we want to define these muscle groups. However, we are defining them with some simplistic line work and shading, as opposed to actually drawing in these muscle groups as if they were exposed and not covered in skin. And this is how we want to engage with working in these muscle groups now once we have established the outline of the leg. So from that frontal view, what we'll find is that we're not necessarily drawing very harsh segmentations of muscles defined through line work, but what we are doing is we're using more of a subtle approach with our shading and line work to kind of show how shadow formations on the surface of the skin are affected by those muscles from beneath the surface of the skin. And this is where we want to basically work in shading as a way of defining these muscle groups. So from the quadricep muscles, what we can start to do is we can start actually working in some light shading and line work that kind of defines those elongated muscle structures. Now as we come to the knee, we'll find that the patella has this kind of squarish or at least rectangular blocky structure, and what we want to consider is that as bones and muscles have different compositional values, in the sense that they are different structures, they're going to create different shadow formations or bulge from beneath the surface of the skin in different ways. So the muscle groups have a more curved fibrous quality to them. So as they bulge from beneath the surface of the skin, the shadow formation on the surface of the leg is a little less harsh. Obviously, the more defined the muscles are, the more defined the shadow formation will be, and that's what we want to consider. However, around the knee area, we'll find that bone kind of creates these more harsh lines due to the very blocky or geometric quality of the bone structure. And this is particularly true for the bone that runs down the center of the lower leg, which is the shin bone, and the muscle groups around the shin bone will have a more subtle or less harsh shadow formation. Now, because we're drawing in a defined muscular structure within our legs, we can play around with making those shadow formations pretty defined. It's all dependent on how defined you want the legs to look. We need to consider that when light hits the surface of the skin, these muscle groups, as they protrude from beneath the surface of the skin, they're going to cause shadow formations around them. And that is essentially what we want to do now. Working with our pencils, what we're going to do is we're going to spend time working on both these legs now that we understand the muscle groups, or maybe looking at a diagram alongside your drawing process, we can then start working in some shading to further define these muscle groups with our pencil. Now again, obviously the upper leg muscles are going to be slightly larger than that of the lower leg muscles, and this is because the quadricep muscles tend to be quite large in relation to the lower leg muscles. Now again, the lower leg muscles that run down the leg towards the ankle, so we want to think about them as more fibrous, thinner muscles that flow along the shin bone, especially from the front view. The front view will find that the shin bone kind of protrudes and therefore creates this angle that divides the leg into two sections. So what we are seeing is that the front view of the leg drawing, the gastrocnemius muscle, the calf muscle present in the back of the leg, will have this bulging, protruding quality that gives the lower leg a more triangular form that becomes more narrow near the ankle. However, when we transition to the side angle, what we're seeing is that gastrocnemius muscle is a little bit more defined and becomes a little bit more significant in its shadow formation due to the fact that it is quite large within that lower section of the leg. So we want to think about how we represent these elongated strand muscles, or these anterior muscles such as the tibialis anterior, or the peroneus muscles such as the peroneus longus, these kind of long muscles that flow down to the shin. Again, when the leg is really defined, these muscle groups become a little bit more prominent. However, the muscles aren't necessarily harsh angles, so the subtle curvature should be defined by more subtle shading and line work. Now, as we proceed with this drawing and we kind of shift our shading, pencil shading, into the leg from the side view, we can slowly work up towards the thigh area. Now, previously we worked from the thigh muscles down to the shin or the lower leg muscles on the left leg, but on the right leg, with the side angle, we can spend time on the lower features as they are a little bit more complicated, and because the calf muscle or the gastrocnemius muscle is being flexed, the surrounding muscles are a little bit more significantly present as well. So those muscle groups are quite narrow and quite closely compact, so spending time on those muscles makes a lot of sense, and then we can start flowing from that lower section into the knee and ultimately then into the higher quadricep muscles present in the thigh. Now, as we shift from these lower muscles, the peroneus muscles, the gastrocnemius muscle, just the muscles present in the lower section of the leg, and kind of flow towards the knee, we'll start to see that from a side view, we will see that the muscle group's connection to the patella will create a kind of different shadow formation. So on the inside of the patella, where it starts to connect to the quadricep muscles, specifically the vastus medialis, we will see that the connection point will create this little groove between the vastus medialis and the kneecap or the patella. And this is something to bear in mind. Obviously, around the patella are these tendons and bone structures, and that is something we want to pay attention to in terms of how that side angle defines that connection point between the muscles surrounding the bone structure, both from the lower leg and the upper leg. Now, as we move into the upper leg and we define the muscle groups, specifically the quadricep muscle groups, we also find that we start to see a little bit of the hamstring muscle groups. Now, the hamstrings are obviously the muscles that are prevalent in the back area or the back section of the quadricep muscles, or the back side of the upper leg. However, we're not necessarily seeing the entire hamstring muscle groups, but what we are seeing is the sartorius, which is that kind of rubber band like muscle that flows from the inside groin area all the way around to the area that is placed behind the kneecap, where the leg kind of bends. So this is something to think about. Another muscle that is slightly present is one of the main hamstring muscles, which is that central muscle down the back of the leg called the rectus femoris, as well as the vastus lateralis. Now again, when we see the side angle of the leg and how it connects to the central features such as the kneecap, the patella, the bone structure, and then ultimately flows into the lower sections such as the gastrocnemius. Something we want to understand that the femoris, those muscle groups behind the leg in the hamstring area, kind of wrap around towards the knee area, whereas the gastrocnemius kind of falls into that bending area behind the knee. So this is why it's really important to consider looking at diagrams of legs when drawing legs or any anatomical feature. You want to make sure you kind of understand what the compositional values are, how the structure is actually formed with bone, cartilagen, muscle groups, and so on. And this is just going to give you a better understanding of how to form these drawings a little bit more accurately and how to scale them and these different muscle groups in relation to one another. Now, once we have completed some line work and shading with our pencils, we should have two defined legs at this point. What we're going to start doing now is transitioning into utilizing some pen work to emphasize these features and give them slightly more contrast and therefore giving it a little bit more of a three-dimensional quality. Now, when it comes to working with pen, a good suggestion is to definitely use ballpoint pen. The reason why we would want to use ballpoint pen is because it works very similar to a pencil. Ballpoint pen's ink comes out quite sparingly, so this gives us a lot of agency over our mark making process, and what we can do is we can actually layer ink the same way you would layer pencil marks, and this will allow us to build up tonal values. Now, as we proceed to shading in these features, what we're going to do is we're going to use the pencil marks to guide us as we darken these features. So we're not introducing new features, we're simply using the shading and line work established by our pencils to assist us with our pen shading process. And this is where we can start to create these gradients from the creases defined or the segmentations defined between muscle groups. We can darken them and then slowly create these gradients that shift to more lighter tonal values as it comes to the more exposed, flattened surface areas of each of these muscle groups. So starting with the left leg again, what we can start doing is we can start working from the knee area where the shadow formations would be slightly more harsh. It's really important for us to think about gradient shifts. What is meant by gradient shifts is that when shadows form along the surface of the skin due to these protruding features from beneath the skin, there's going to be these darkened shadows close to the protrusions, but then those shadows slightly lighten as they become a little bit more present or exposed to a light source on the surface of these muscle groups and areas that seem to be a little bit more flat and rounded in the leg, which naturally would have a little bit more exposure to light. So this is something we want to think about as we proceed with our pen shading process. So working with your pens, what we can start doing is we can start working all the way through from the knee down towards the lower leg muscle groups, where we start to consider the bone structure of the shin and how this will create a more shadowed side and a lighter side due to the shadows developed by the protrusions made by the muscle groups and bone structures. Now, we really want to make sure we take our time with our pen shading. Again, we want to make sure that we are layering tonal values on top of each other, and what is meant by that is that we don't necessarily need to apply too much pressure to our pen when shading. What we want to do is we want to build up tonal values with light layers, and this is where we add layer on top of layer until we achieve a certain darkness or lightness in our pen marks within our leg drawing. Another thing we want to think about as we proceed to shade in these features within the legs is that these muscle groups are also layered on top of one another. So that means they're going to have different effects in terms of shadow formation. So for instance, in the lower leg section, those muscle groups are kind of tightly compact together. So the layering effect is not as intense as that of the upper leg muscle groups. So for instance, in the quadricep muscles, that large bulging muscle on the inside of the knee, known as the vastus medialis, that is going to kind of bulge quite significantly and therefore cast a shadow wing that forms onto the sartorius muscle, that band-like structure that flows on the inside of the leg all the way to the groin area. Now, another muscle to consider that protrudes quite significantly in the quadricep area is the rectus femoris, which is that central muscle in the leg and creates quite a distinct line or shadow formation that runs down the leg all the way to the outside of the patella, and this is where it's going to create that distinction between the muscle in the center, the rectus femoris, and the muscle that forms along the outside of the thigh that's quite long, called the vastus lateralis. So again, looking at a diagram is just going to really assist you in a more effective drawing and shading approach to your leg drawing. So we can continue with this process, focusing mainly on one leg before we move on to the next. Once we have completed our pen shading, we can move on to the right leg, where we look at these muscles and their formation within the side view. And again, now this is where it becomes a little bit more interesting, because the right leg side view is demonstrating these muscle groups in a more flexed position, so they become slightly more prominent, and we can also see how they wrap around the leg, causing more significant striations. Now again, what we can do is we want to use our pencil marks as a means of guiding us as we integrate some pen shading to add contrast. Another key thing to remember is that we don't necessarily want to create harsh marks, but we want to build up our layers and slowly develop them into the tonal variations that we feel that we are satisfied with. Now, when it comes to the side view of the lower leg, we'll start to see that these peroneus muscles, as well as the gastrocnemius, as well as the tibialis, all those lower leg muscles that kind of have those elongated structures throughout the leg, become a little bit more prominent. And what we want to do is we want to kind of use our pencil marks to guide us as we significantly increase the contrast between these striations developed in between the muscle groups that run vertically and parallel down the leg. We want to make sure that we're just basically using our pens to kind of emphasize those features. Now, as we continue with our pen marks, we'll see that as we slowly come up to the gastrocnemius muscle, which is the more largely or biggest bulging muscle within the lower leg, the calf muscle, that area again is going to have a lot more highlights and therefore a lot more negative space, which is due to the fact that that muscle group is going to have a much larger surface area because of how much it bulges and how significantly it protrudes from the surface of the skin. Now, as we kind of continue working our way into the central area, we will start to see that the hamstring muscle, such as the bicep femoris, flows into these tendon structures known as the semitendinosus, which creates this connecting points into the patella and ultimately wraps or connects to the gastrocnemius muscle. Now, we don't necessarily see these muscle groups entirely. However, we do see that slight strand of that tendon creating a striation that connects into the calf muscle and kind of forms that inner section at the back of the leg opposite to the patella, which is present on the front of the leg. Another thing we can see again is how the vastus medialis kind of connects to the patella through another tendon structure and creates that little ridge or crevice inside the leg near the patella or underneath the patella. And this is where we want to consider how our pen marks or adding contrast and our tonal values become significantly important in terms of defining those indentations or those crevices or those striations around those muscle groups and bone structures to define them a little bit more significantly. But it's all a matter of building up layers. Again, we don't necessarily need to shade in dark marks from the get-go. Rather, what we want to do is we want to build up these layers and then ultimately work in layers until we have come to a tonal value that we are happy with. As we continue to work up the leg, what we'll start to see is that the vastus medialis, that inner quad muscle, is quite significantly defined by the striations developed between that muscle and the surrounding muscle groups. The surrounding muscle groups, such as the hamstring muscle groups, that kind of wrap towards the inside of the leg. So that semitendinosus muscle that kind of goes all the way towards the patella is creating this striation between muscle groups that kind of go towards the inner groin area, such as the gracilis. And this is why it's really important for us to have a diagrammatical understanding of these muscle groups. The more we understand, the more we can make sense of how these muscle groups form. We can also see that the sartorius, that band-like structure, becomes a little bit more prominent as it wraps over the vastus vastus medialis and becomes this strand-like structure that protrudes and causes another striation or shadow formation that runs all the way from the top inner thigh area all the way down towards the kneecap. The vastus medialis, again, that large bulging muscle, is going to create very significant indentation as it connects towards the patella, and this is where we really want to consider those small moments of how these muscle groups have this larger surface area and therefore are going to create more distinct shadow formations around it, and therefore are going to also have more highlights on their surface area. So we need to think about the compositional value of these muscles, how they fit together, how this causes striations, how they bulge from beneath the surface of the skin, as well as how large the muscle group is in terms of surface area and how much it's going to be exposed to light source and therefore have more highlights present. Now, beyond understanding the muscle groups and understanding how they fit together, something to really think about is how the inner features, the features that are close towards the inner thigh area, are going to be slightly more shadowed due to the fact that they'll be less exposed to light. So naturally, the way legs are more revealed to light in a normal or naturalistic sense is that the outer features tend to be slightly lighter, where when you're dealing with a more defined leg structure, naturally the muscles throughout the entire leg, whether it's the inner side or the outer side, are going to cause significant shadow formations. But that being said, predominantly the inner thigh areas will always tend to be slightly darker, and this is because they're obviously less exposed to light. And this is something we want to think about in terms of creating these gradients of shadow within the leg to create a more realistic three-dimensional nature in the leg drawing. So we want to think about our muscle groups, how they protrude, how they create striations, how to develop shadows within those striations, how to strategically incorporate negative space to represent highlights on the exposed features, and predominantly where the darkest areas will be, which obviously tend to be the inner thigh areas. Now, this process is simply a matter of taking your time, being patient, building up your layers, but this is the general process of how to draw muscular legs. It's first understanding the generalized shape, it's understanding the muscle groups, how they fit together, developing that in a sketch, then integrating some shading to emphasize those features, and ultimately working in some darker contrasted marks, whether it's with pen or a dark pencil, to really emphasize those qualities. When it comes to the shading process, really key things to think about is gradient shift. How do we represent the moments of highlights and shadows and how they shift seamlessly from and between one another in terms of how these muscle groups are formed within the leg structure holistically. We are now going to shift into drawing some female legs. Now, in the case of this tutorial, we'll be shifting gears a little bit, where we draw the female legs from a more back side angle, and this is where we explore muscle groups in a new context as well as in a new angle. We will be drawing a more slim toned type of female leg. Again, there's all sorts of leg types to draw. However, in this tutorial we'll be covering basics so we can keep the legs quite simple and neutral in shape to not overcomplicate the drawing process. So that being said, we're going to start off by drawing or starting to draw the female legs the same way we did with the male legs, and this is where we want to establish those general shapes. Again, there's a reference image in the link below to this video to kind of assist you in your drawing process. However, the processes applied or used within this video can be applied to your own drawings. So again, what we want to do is we first want to establish the general shape of the legs, and this is where we kind of capture the upper section and the lower section of the legs. However, in the case of a female structure, what we are doing here is we're kind of keeping the curvatures of the muscle groups a little bit more subtle to create this more neutral and toned quality in the leg. Now, as we start with the basic shaping of the legs, remember that we want to first understand the top section, the middle section, and the lower section in the leg. We first want to understand them in their most basic fundamental shapes, and this is where we can start drawing in those elongated, rectangular or oval-like shapes, where we can slowly work out the scale in relation to one another. Now, something to think about again is the lower leg tends to be quite similar in length to the upper leg. However, it will be different in width. Now, because we're also drawing the legs being established from the gluteus maximus, we really want to consider that the length of the upper leg is slightly longer or a little longer in length than that of the lower leg. We also want to establish the gluteus maximus structure from that side angle, where the left leg is obviously going to be slightly more present. So the left leg is quite dominant in visibility, and we get a more holistic view of the entire left leg, whereas we'll only get a partial view of the right leg. Now, we want to think about the gluteus maximus as this really large muscle group that is basically the largest muscle group in the upper leg section and is quite rounded, almost like a more rounded square-like structure. It also depends on how defined the muscle group is. In the case of a female structure, they tend to be slightly more by body fat, so this gives a more rounded quality to the gluteus maximus. As we flow into that bicep femoris area, which is the hamstring muscle, as well as the semitendinosus area, we start to see the more outer muscles a little bit more visible. So this is the bicep femoris and the vastus lateralis that is causing a slight curvature within the backside of the leg. Now, again, we're also starting to see that the vastus medialis is going to cause a subtle curvature, but more significantly from this outside angle where we can see the glutes flowing down into the quadricep muscles and ultimately into the knee, what we are seeing more visible as a protruding muscle is the vastus lateralis, and that's what we're seeing protruding or giving a slight curvature to the front quad or thigh area as it flows into the kneecap. Now, as we kind of work our way down to the calf muscles, again, we want to consider that the gastrocnemius muscle is significantly the largest muscle in the calf area. We don't necessarily need to create a more significant bulging quality similar to that of a male structure. However, we can keep it quite in its curvature, and that way we're not creating a muscle group that is significantly larger than the rest of the muscle groups present in the leg. Again, as these muscles flow into the lower leg muscles, such as the flexor digitorum longus, or all those extensor muscles near the ankle, it starts to become more narrow again, and then ultimately flowing into the foot. So these are things we want to think about. Again, it's the same as the male structure. We really want to think about these muscle groups. However, this time the muscle groups are just slightly less emphatic to that of the female muscle groups, and this is how we create that more feminine-like toned quality. Naturally, the gluteus maximus will slightly be larger than that of the male structure in terms of scale relation. So what I mean by that is it's not necessarily larger than the male gluteus maximus, but it is larger in relation to how the gluteus maximus for female leg is compared in scale to the rest of the female leg muscles. And naturally, because the female gluteus maximus has more body fat surrounding those muscle groups, it tends to be slightly more rounded, which is quite a unique quality to a more feminine type leg. Now, as we proceed with this early pencil sketch phase, again, our intention here is to really just take our time shaping the leg, making sure the scale is correct. And this is where we really want to make sure that the outline of the leg is captured as accurately as possible before we start integrating some pencil shading. Naturally, because the left leg is more visible from the outside, what we are seeing is the right leg visible on the inside. So we are seeing all those inner features visible in the right leg, and this is where we start to see the inner thigh muscles or the inner quadricep muscles, such as the semimembranosus muscle, the semitendinosus muscle, the garcilius, the abductor group, and the sartorius muscle, that all flow as these kind of vertical strands on the inside of the leg all the way to the inner knee area or the patella, and ultimately connecting to the gastrocnemius muscle, which is the calf muscle. Now, naturally, again, because these muscles are a little bit more subtle and less refined or defined to that of the male structure, we won't necessarily have these really harsh shadow formations or line formations defining the striations between these muscle groups, but rather we'll have a little bit more of a smoother, more evened out surface area, and this is because those muscle groups obviously are less protruding from beneath the surface of the skin, and ultimately creating a more flattened skin surface area with more subtle shading. So this is also a great way to also practice creating these muscle formations in a more subtle approach, and that way you understand how to define these muscles in a significant approach in the context of a male drawing, and in a more subtle approach in the context of a female leg drawing. Now, continue with your pencil drawing process. Make sure that you really just work on the outline, and then we can slowly start to shift into working in some pencil line work and shading, where we start subtly defining these muscle groups and how they transition from the upper leg to the lower leg. Now again, when it comes to kind of representing these muscle groups in a female structure or the female leg structure, what we want to do is be very subtle with our shadow formations. So for instance, we can start integrating some shadow formations into the leg to define these muscle groups. However, this time we're going to be a little bit more soft with our pencil shading. We don't necessarily need to create these really intense striations. Rather, the outline and the form of the leg is more significant, or at least more important, in the sense that we want to represent the curvature defined by these muscle groups. So spending a good time on the outline of the leg and making sure that the muscle groups are defined by the outline is really important. Then we can start integrating some shading. Starting with the right leg, what we can start to consider is how the hamstring muscles kind of run down the leg in this vertical fashion. So for instance, the bicep femoris muscle, that large vertical muscle that runs all the way from the gluteus maximus around to the front patellar area of the knee, or the inside of the knee, is going to be quite significant. So we really want to make sure we capture the outline of the leg as best as we can, as they are determining the curvature and shape of those muscle groups. So for instance, naturally the semitendinosus, the muscle that kind of runs all the way from the gluteus maximus to the inside of the leg, is going to be quite protruding as a significant muscle that creates a curvature at the back of the thigh. Now, what we want to consider is also that little gap between the semitendinosus muscle as well as the semimembranosus muscles and the gastrocnemius muscles, or otherwise known as the calf muscles. There's this little gap a bit behind the leg where the leg bends, and we want to kind of represent that through the use of shadow formation, which we can define by integration of shading. Now, naturally, as we come to the gastrocnemius muscle, we want to have a little bit more that just defines the curvature of the gastrocnemius muscle as it flows to a more narrow section of the leg near the ankle area, where the soleus muscles and the peroneus muscles start to connect to the ankles. Now, we are also seeing that the patella is quite visible from this angle on the right leg, and that means that we want to consider again the inner muscles on the inside thigh area, specifically the gracilis muscle and the semitendinosus muscle and the semimembranosus muscles, and how they kind of flow into the patella. And what we want to define is that subtle shadow gradient. We can also be quite specific with how the gastrocnemius muscle causes a striation that flows all the way from the lower section of the leg, where these flexor digitorum longus muscles are defined, but whereas the gastrocnemius muscle is actually creating a striation between the gastrocnemius and the soleus as it protrudes, but then ultimately also creates the striation that defines the distinction between the gastrocnemius muscle and the shin bone that flows into the patella. So making sure we understand diagrammatically what we're drawing is a really key essential part of making an accurate representation of a legs drawing. And this is why we want to spend some time kind of working out the muscle groups, making sure that we understand their placement and how they connect to one another. In the case of this right leg, seeing it from a back angle, what we are seeing is more of the hamstring muscles, and as they flow into the back features or muscle groups at the lower leg. And this is where the gastrocnemius muscle is distinctly defined as this curved or bulging feature in the lower leg section. So we can actually see how that gastrocnemius or that calf muscle creates almost like an arc shape. It's quite rounded near the bottom section of its composition, and then that is creating that subtle striation between that muscle group, that calf gastrocnemius muscle group, and the soleus muscle group, and we can start to see how the leg becomes then narrow. So we want to take our time really making sure we understand the placement of these features, understanding diagrammatically how these muscle groups fit together, and this is going to give us a better sense of how to define these muscle groups through the utilization of pencil shading, line work, and ultimately some pen shading. So what we can do now is we can start transitioning to the other leg. Drawing legs from a back view is quite unique because, again, we're starting to see these muscle groups in a different way. The same can be said for the left leg, which is kind of visible from the front view. However, we are seeing these back features, but the outside features rather than the inner muscle groups or the inner features. So what I mean by this is the right leg is demonstrating the muscle groups that are present on the inner thigh area of the right leg, whereas the left leg is demonstrating the muscle groups that are visible on the outer side of the thigh. And this is the same process. Again, when we are drawing these shadows, what we are trying to understand is that these muscle groups have different compositions. Now, for the most part, these muscle groups are the same in the sense that they run vertically down the leg, and that's the same for the quadricep area and the lower muscle groups, as well as the hamstrings. So the muscle groups all kind of flow in this vertical direction. However, the upper muscle groups, or the quadricep muscle groups and hamstring muscle groups that we can see present in the left leg are slightly larger, whereas the muscle groups in the lower leg tend to be a little more narrow and quite compact to one another. Now, again, as we proceed, we can start working in some shadow formations into the left leg to define these muscle groups further. And this is where we're going to start seeing the tibialis anterior, or those outside muscle groups along the outside shin area a little bit more defined due to the angle. So we really want to consider how those muscle groups in the lower leg area have these more thinner, narrow, strand-like qualities that run down the leg. Again, when it comes to creating that more feminine, more subtle muscle representation in the drawing, what we want to do is be a little bit more subtle with our shadow formation and therefore our shading process. So what we want to do is want to create those striations, but this time the line work is going to be less distinct and a little bit more seamless in terms of how it transitions throughout the leg. This is particularly true for the lower leg section, where those more narrow, thinly denser strand-like muscle groups become a little bit more prominent, but in the case of how it contrasts or creates a striation between the gastrocnemius muscle and then the soleus and the peroneus longus muscle, we can be a little bit more seamless by the integration of a smoother shading rather than distinct line work. And this is where we can also start to think about what kinds of shading techniques we use in terms of how to create more distinct and less distinct representations of muscle groups. Now, again, what we want to do is we want to slowly work up and build these muscle groups in the leg, first with some pencil work, where we slowly transition from the lower leg section into the upper thigh section, and ultimately defining those three main areas, such as the lower leg, the middle area where the knee joins to the upper leg, and then obviously the third section being the upper leg area. Now, remember that when we are seeing the left leg from the outside view, what we are seeing is that the vastus lateralis muscle, or the bicep femoris muscles, are going to be visible in a different way. And this is where, again, we can be a little bit more subtle and smooth and seamless with our striation developments within our drawing, or how we define those striations through the use of our drawing process. The same is for the lower leg. Again, what we're trying to do is define these muscle groups, but we don't need to define every single muscle group. We want to understand that those muscle groups are going to be slightly less defined in a female figure to that of or compared to that of a male figure. So we don't necessarily need to draw in a striation shadow mark for every single muscle in the lower and upper leg. The main muscle in the quadricep area that will be visible is the bicep femoris, kind of forming that slight curvature in the hamstring area at the back, and then the vastus lateralis, which kind of flows from the gluteus maximus and wraps around the leg. and that's the muscle that we see on the outside of the thigh that connects to the outside section of the patella rather than the inner knee section of the patella. Now again, build up this drawing with your pencil, and once we have done so and integrated pencil shading, we have established these muscle groups with our pencil marks, we can start transitioning into darkening these features with our pen marks. We don't necessarily need to go over the entire pen shading process, but again guys, the intention is the same as it was for the male drawing, where when we integrate pen marks, what we are not doing is introducing new marks. What we should have done is establish the muscle groups and the leg in a pencil sketch with shading, and then what we will do is use those pencil marks to guide us with our pen drawing process. Again, some key things to think about as you integrate your pen work is the muscle formation in the female leg is a lot more smoother, so you want to build up layers and kind of work layers into these different features until you have achieved a tonal value that you are happy with. Naturally, with these female more subtle striations developed or defined within the legs, we will have a more seamless and smooth transition between shadowed and highlighted areas. Now again, naturally something to think about is because these muscles are less defined, there's going to be a lot more flattening or at least a more subtle curvature in these muscle groups and the transition between muscle groups, and therefore the distinctions defined by shadow formation are going to be a little bit more smooth, a little bit more seamless. So this is why we want to build up layers with our pen as opposed to make harsh, dark, distinct, which wouldn't necessarily achieve that smooth transition between muscle groups all the way from the upper leg area to the lower leg area. Now, something to think about again as we proceed with some pen shading, and you can take it to the degree you would like in terms of how much contrast, is the exposure to light. Again, these features aren't as protruding or as defined from beneath the surface of the skin compared to that of a male structure. So even with the legs flexing, what we see are very subtle protrusions of these muscle groups, and therefore it's going to create a lot more subtle shadow formations. These shadow formations are also going to have a more seamless gradient between the darker areas and the lighter areas. Another thing we want to think about is light would naturally struggle to penetrate the areas towards the inner thighs, as these areas tend to be less exposed to a light source in a more naturalistic sense. Otherwise, guys, this is the general process of how to draw legs. We want to think about shape. We want to think about refining that shape and capturing an accurate outline where we determine scale and capture the scale between these different three main sections as correctly as possible. Then once that is done, then you can start to integrate these different muscle formations using the outlines as a demarcated area in which you can draw these different muscle groups, from the quadricep muscles to the hamstring muscles to the lower leg muscles, as well as the details around the knee bone structure. I hope this tutorial was helpful. I hope there were key principles and ideas that you can utilize in your own anatomical drawing process. Again, when it comes to anatomy, it's really important to also diagrammatically understand how these components and muscle groups and bone structures fit together, which ones are larger, which ones are smaller, and what is the compositional nature of these structures. If they're bony, if they have a more harder surface and geometric quality to them, or if they're more rounded and a little bit more seamless and smooth in terms of how they protrude from the skin, and so on and so on. Really make sure that when you pursue a leg drawing, take some time to research into the leg muscles if you would like to achieve a more realistic representation of a leg in your drawing. Otherwise, guys, that's it from me. I hope this was helpful. If so, please drop a like, please subscribe. That will help us a lot. We will be covering more anatomical drawing topics. If you'd like any specific drawing topic or anatomy related drawing topic to be done, feel free to comment below. Otherwise, guys, that's it from me. See you in the next video. Cheers.